welcome to this episode of Battling with Business with me, Chris Kitchener.
And me, Gareth Tennant.
In this podcast, we explore ideas and concepts around teams and teamwork, leaders and leadership, and all things in between. It's a discussion between a former Royal Marines officer and a product manager from the world of business, comparing and contrasting our experiences as we attempt to work out what makes teams, leaders, and businesses tick. And you join us this week with Gareth in colder climes and me in slightly sunnier climes. So, Gareth, where are you today?
I'm back out in Canada, so I'm working for my client in Ontario, where it is nice? A balmy -15.
-15, nice. Well, back in Oxfordshire, it's a slightly overcast day, but luckily it's 8 degrees and somewhat warmer. So I think I'm doing slightly better in that. When I took the dog for a walk, I didn't get frostbite, so that was a good thing. But today is another one of our influencers podcasts. And today, this is one that Gareth has been talking about doing for a while. And actually, we would have recorded a couple of weeks ago, but Gareth's really been digging in on the research. And I'll let him talk about what that means, because it's not just the same kind of research we do normally. Gareth, who is our influencer today?
Today, Chris, we are looking at Carl von Clausewitz.
Carl von Clausewitz.
So what do you know about Clausewitz?
Well, the problem with this podcast is that we're far too honest for our own good. I don't know much about Carl von Clausewitz at all. I know he was German. I know he was a military man. He has von in his name, which makes me think he was, I was going to say landed gentry, not the right word, but he was, privileged to some degree. It was, I think, early 20th century. I could be wrong. It could be earlier than that. And he is a man that talks about strategy. And he is a man that has been extraordinarily influential in people's thinking about strategy and the art of war. And I think whenever you hear the word von Clausewitz, you also think of the word Sun Tzu and various others. But actually, what he teaches and how he teaches it, I don't know anything about. So it's a mysterious world for me.
That was not bad. He slightly earlier, so he died in 1831.
Okay.
So he was born in 1780, died in 1831. But yeah, you're right. He was obviously, Germany didn't exist as a country. He was Prussian, but what is now modern day German. Yeah, you're right. He was born into a reasonably well-to-do family. It was a military family. So he came from military roots, served in the Prussian army, and learned an awful lot because he joined the Prussian army at the age of 12. He was educated at the Prussian Military Academy, which at the time was seen as one of the best military academies, especially for understanding the nature of conflict and how young officers become great generals. So there was a whole load of sort of foundational work that led him to be the man that he became, which is, well, I say the man that he became, actually, his great work, it's a book called Von Krieg, or On War, was actually published after his death. So he wrote a whole series of notes throughout his career, and his experiences of the Napoleonic Wars and his study as well. And a lot of it comes from study of battles that he wasn't actually in. He does have operational experience. He had first-hand experience of leading men. He had first-hand experience of being on the planning staff, which means he worked with generals coming up with the war plans and the battle plans. But a lot of what he wrote was from private study of other battles that he wasn't involved in. He was a great historian.
I was about to say, isn't it interesting? And I feel quite bad when I hear this, because I don't do enough of this, but lots and lots and lots of our influencers, obviously the military ones more than anything else, spend lots of time looking at previous wars and previous battles and histories, ranging from sort of early history through to modern, but it's fascinating where to be a great military strategist and tactician, you need to understand how the Romans fought, how the, across history, how different people have fought, irrespective of the technology. And it's a question for you at Lympstone and through your career, is that still something that the British military does?
Yes, it is. And actually, Clausewitz is one of the key historical figures that is still studied. And it's the reason that I've chosen to do an influence episode on Carl von Clausewitz is he is revered as this legendary force who understood contemporary conflict. It's interesting. He literally wrote about the role of history. And I'm going to read this for you. So this is obviously translated from the original Prussian, old German. But in general terms, the nature of war remains, and so theoretical study and lessons can be learned. However, theory cannot be properly understood without experience of practice. History in the general can be useful, but in the specifics, there is little to be gained through the study of history from the remote. And I think what he means by that is there are trends that we need to be aware of. But of course, as the character of war changes, and we'll talk about his view on the character and the nature slightly later on, but as the character of war changes because of changes in technology, changes in social attitudes, changes in behavior, as a result of the contemporary operating environment, the specifics from the way the Romans fought, or the way the Greeks fought, or the way that the Napoleonic wars were conducted is less relevant. And that makes perfect sense. So what he's effectively, advocating for is understanding and studying and discussing history, but not using it as a stick to beat other people with, to say this is the right way of doing things.
Well, it's not a it's not a template. If you repeat what they did in the Third Battle of Thermopylae, you will win. It is how did they think about the Third Battle of Thermopylae, and why did what they think influence what they did?
Yeah, exactly that. And I think that there's an important point. So we'll go back to On War and how it came about and what it is. But there's an important point here, which is, as I said, we do still study historical figures. We do still look at history and we still discuss it. I think in the right way. I don't think we try and learn, particular tactical lessons. We talk about how things would be different in the contemporary environment. We talk about decisions that were made and why they were perhaps made, and talk about culture more than technology. But Clausewitz has become this almost caricature. And so when we talk about Clausewitz, I think we're actually we don't fully understand Clausewitz. One of the reasons I really wanted to do this is I hadn't read On War. It's been one of those books that's on my reading list for about 20 years, but it's daunting. It's 800 pages. It's actually 8 books. It's 800 pages, translated from Old German, so the language is difficult, and it is incredibly hard to plow through. It's taken me months to read this. And we talk about Clausewitz in the military a lot, but I think from a secondary perspective, because very few people have actually read the book.
Did you find that by reading the book, you took away either subtly or clearly different things from what you had heard secondhand?
Yes. So I think a lot of the key themes we've talked about in my career in the military, in sort of study days or in training, and a lot of the key things were things that were familiar to me, but in a abstract sense, in that when you actually look at the language and you actually look at what he's talking about in the context of Napoleonic era conflict, we've twisted them. And I think there's this really important point, which is we talk about Clausewitz, and as I said, I think we actually talk about a caricature of Clausewitz. And one of the things we often try to do is to break down his I was nearly going to say ramblings, and that would completely be unfair and
A
not
nuanced discussion and turn it into bullet points, cliff notes.
Yes, and Clausewitz wrote 8 books, and I think they are his journey. He is learning as he's writing. Some of it is clearly things that he's reflected on, come up with key insights, but we've almost turned them into sort of axiomatic rules. And I think Clausewitz would be aghast at that. From the sense I get is that he talks often about the fact that you can study things, but until you've experienced them, until you've combined that study with the experience and learn difficult lessons, you can't become an expert. And it's probably worth going back and sort of talking about how the book On War or Vom Krieg came about.
Just before we do that, by the way, I think he sounds like our kind of guy. We'd have him on the podcast and we'd agree and disagree, and it would work well. This may be an unfair question, and maybe I have to revisit it at the end, but Clausewitz is this enormous figure in the world of military strategy. I would imagine even in the Russian war colleges today, they talk about Clausewitz. Why him as opposed to anyone else? Was it? No, actually, why him? Why is it we're talking about Clausewitz today versus some other general or someone else? What has made him so long-lived?
So your listeners that cast their minds back, who have listened to our episode on the difference between strategy and tactics, may remember me talking about the etymology of the word strategy and the fact that it comes from the art
strategos.
Strategios. Yeah.
Okay. God, I remember our own podcast. That's a bit
it goes right back to Peloponnesian Greek ways of war, and that is, but for Western military study at least, that is our foundation. That is where we start to see the professionalization of arms and the idea of organized military force in a way that we would recognize today in the West. So you have these generals. Up until Clausewitz, it was very much a dictatorial process, and there were rules and there were structures and there were drills and there were ways of doing things. And if you think about Roman or Grecian sort of ancient war, there are these very set choreographed processes. So the reason the Romans were so effective was that they were organized such that their centurions could withstand hordes of barbarians because they worked together as teams in this drilled, organized fashion. Clausewitz was the first, or certainly the most famous of the writers on the character and nature of conflict and warfare to recognize the balance between having process and having initiative, and the need to be adaptive to a changing environment, but not so much so that you are just reacting. It's that balance of having a song sheet from which everybody is starting from, the doctrine, but being able to apply it to the particular conditions that you find yourself in. I think that's why I think it was an almost revolutionary approach to see the brilliance of some of the great generals of the Napoleonic War through this lens of why they were successful. And it led to war colleges across the world sort of picking up on these lessons and building on them. And it's still relevant today. And I think that's why it's endured. Yeah, we can't take the axiomatic kind of apply Clausewitz principles, but this idea that war is a combination of order and disorder, and it's this paradoxical balancing of needing to be extremely organized, but in a very chaotic condition, that still, that is the enduring nature of conflict. So it's worth noting, though, as I said, there were 8 books. So Carl von Clausewitz died in 1831. Vom Krieg was published in 1832, and it was actually pulled together by his wife, Marie von Brühl, who again was an aristocratic Prussian. But after his death, she fell upon hard times, and for need of money, took his papers that I don't think he ever, well, there's no evidence to suggest that he was writing this to, to be published. He taught in war colleges. So I suspect he was writing this with an audience in mind, but not as a published piece of work. But his wife pulled this together along with the editor. And the last book, which was War Plans, book 8, was actually incomplete. And the further through you get, the more there is a sense of they are trying to pull together, this disparate group of notes, which is why I think I'll talk about what the books are in a moment, but I think you will get a sense as I talk through them why some of the key things that people know about Clausewitz are come through in those first few books, because they're edited and more concise, because Clausewitz himself had spent more time on them. So he died quite early. He was born in Magdeburg in Prussia, which is now Germany. And I said he went into the military. He fought in the Napoleonic War. He rose through the ranks to be quite senior and quite seasoned, but was never a commanding general. So he was never operationally commanding vast divisions or armies. He did command, but he commanded at what would be considered sort of middle management or mid-command level. So applying tactics rather than strategy, but of course worked on strategic staff where he did planning. Before I go through the books, I want to kind of just tackle one of the things that Clausewitz is perhaps best known about, and I'm going to ask you about this. Have you heard of the concept of the center of gravity?
I've heard the words. I can guess what it means. I'm not going to, because I don't think that's useful, but it's words I've heard thrown around, but I wouldn't be able to define them accurately or explain what it is.
Sure. The center of gravity is one of these things that has absolutely endured and is still something that we apply in military analysis when looking at adversarial forces, but also when looking at our own forces to this day. And now there are NATO definitions. The US War College has their definition. Defense Academy of the United Kingdom have their definitions, and throughout our doctrine we talk about the center of gravity. This is a slightly controversial point. Clausewitz talks about things that could be related to the center of gravity throughout the book, but he defines them in different ways. And it was actually the late historian Michael Howard who translated the meaning of the center of gravity in a way that we've picked up and run with. And so I would argue that the contemporary view of center of gravity is a combination of Clausewitz's view and Michael Howard. So the contemporary view it's this idea that you will find a point within an adversary force that is their center of gravity, that when undermined will allow for a rapid collapse of their force and you to gain victory. Now, that doesn't have to be a physical point. It could be an ideological point. It could be a geographic position. It could be a capability. It could be an attitude. But effectively, you break down the center of gravity to identify what the critical capability is. From that critical capability, you work out what the critical resource is. And from that critical resource, you then identify their critical vulnerabilities. And I've got an example of this to kind of bring it to life, which is something I did in my staff college study when I looked at General MacArthur's use of amphibious forces in the Korean War. Looking at the North Korean army, their center of gravity came from their mass, their ability to bring large amounts of force to bear very, very quickly. Whereas MacArthur's center of gravity came from his maneuverist capability and the fact that he could employ the joint force, which meant he could use the Army, the Navy, and the Air Force capabilities collectively together. And you can perhaps see the difference there. One relies on a very centralized and dogmatic approach, and one applies the maneuverist and kind of adaptive approach. And we see that because the North Koreans, came from the communist way of thinking, and MacArthur comes from the Western military way of thinking.
And in that case, presumably the point being is that given the combined arms and the combined services approach, he could effectively remove the advantage that mass brings, because he could go where there wasn't mass and keep avoiding mass and keep prosecuting where there was no mass. Is that
Absolutely.
the principle behind what you're saying?
Yeah, absolutely. So if we look at the North Koreans had this manpower, this ability to bring mass. That was their center of gravity. So their critical capability was their ability to contain the US 8th Army. The army could not break out of their what was known as, I think it was the Pusan perimeter. Effectively, they were contained by this mass.
It was a very small part of South Korea, and effectively, and so therefore there wasn't much room to maneuver.
Absolutely. And so the critical resource that the North Koreans had was the sustainment of their force and the maintenance of morale, their ability to hold the initiative and to keep this large body of people thinking they were they were winning and they were on the winning side. And those two things, if they could continue to sustain this force and continue to convince their people to fight, then they were going to hold the 8th Army in place. That meant their critical vulnerabilities were their lines of communication, their logistical support, and the psychological effect of losing the initiative. So if their lines of communication were broken, if their logistical support was disrupted, and if there was this shocking sense that they were suddenly on the back foot, then the whole system would collapse. And that was the analytical approach that MacArthur's staff took to coming up with the idea of doing an amphibious assault, very, very high risk, right up in the north of the conflict zone, to effectively open up another front, not to gain ground, but to achieve those three things. So that's kind of the idea of a center of gravity. It's this idea that you can very quickly change the way that a conflict is unraveling by identifying those key vulnerabilities that are going to effectively allow the enemy force to collapse like a deck of cards.
What occurs to me as you talk about this is that, of course, these, and correct me if I'm wrong, but it feels like these are tools to help you discover an appropriate strategy for you. These are elements for strategy. Now, in this case, it's a military strategy. I think, and we can talk later about how you can apply these concepts to business strategy. Yeah. I'm imagining that Clausewitz didn't think about business strategy, but did he think about political strategy? What was the connection between the military and the political? Because my assumption is these things are closer than we might imagine today. We don't see military and political together. What was Clausewitz think about this?
Well, I think one of the reasons, again, that his book was so influential in thinking about conflict was, up until Von Krieg was published, war was seen as effectively a thing that armies are told to go and do, and then they go and do. And so there is a separation between the political and the military. What Clausewitz said was that war is an extension of politics by other means. And effectively, there is a intrinsic symbiotic relationship between the use of what is in a contemporary world known as hard power, but to Clausewitz he called the combat, and the geostrategic political environment. And we'll come on to this in more detail later on, but he recognizes this thing called the paradoxical trilogy. And that is this trilogy made up of the people, the government, and the military. And we'll come on to what that means. But effectively, he identified the culture, the people, the way people fight, the government, the instrument of policy, why we fight, and the military, the professional arms, how we fight. And we'll come on to what that could mean in terms of contemporary thinking in a bit. I want to get back to
well, I'm not going to let you, because this is my opportunity.
Okay. Yeah,
we've missed he has missed an opportunity if these three things are not referred to as Clausewitz's balls, just to be clear.
Well, yeah, you've jumped ahead, because I wanted to use that trilogy to say how analogous is that to Adair's balls. If you think about this idea, he called the people he called it the primordial violence, and it's the aspect that represents emotion, passions, irrational elements of human nature, and the collective will of the people to fight. The government he referred to as the instrument of policy. So this is political leadership, the way that policy, strategy, and the machinations of political systems affect the definition of military goals. And I think we in democratic modern societies absolutely feel that and understand that. And then professional army, the military, is how an army is organized in terms of the process, the training, the skills, and the equipment and capabilities that they have at their disposal. And he talked a lot about all of those things. But for me, the people, that primordial violence, is effectively saying people have emotional behaviors, they have attitudes. So that to me is Adair's individuals. You've got to look after people's individual emotional states. You've got to think about how the people are going to behave when looking at the link between individuals, teams, and tasks. The government is the task, because that's what sets the strategic goals, it sets the context for how these things are used. And he talks about the idea of ends, ways, and means. So this concept of you understanding what you're trying to achieve, the ends, the how you're going to do it, the ways, and the capabilities that you have at your disposal, the means. And I think we've got individual in the primordial violence of people. You've got task in terms of the instrument of policy, direct the strategic goals from which military strategy then unfolds. And then obviously the professional army, the military, is those capabilities, and wrapped in capabilities are things like doctrine, concepts, discipline, practice, experience, technology, weapons, logistical support system. All of that is wrapped into the professional army and the capability of arms. And that to me is the team, or it's analogous to this idea of the team. So I think there's a lot of stuff that Clausewitz wrote down, which maybe I'm interpreting it in a way that suits my narrative, but to me there is a lot of concepts in there that are very, very military focused, but can be abstracted out and applied to situations more generally.
What's interesting to me is that this is, and by the way, that does, the way you describe it seems fair, but what seems interesting to me is this, more and more I've used this terrible analogy of cake making, but using more professional language, is the complexity of the factors which can lead to success, whatever that definition is. And it's interesting that Clausewitz is saying, here are a set of factors, each of which have their own subset of factors, and it is the combination of these things which lead you to success. What he's not saying is if you do X and you do Y and you do Z, you will be successful every time. And my job is just, it almost feels like he's saying, here's some tools to think about stuff.
Yeah.
But you still got to come up with the right answer that's suitable based on the context and the particular situation you're in. And I like that. That really resonates with me as anyone who wants the answer to the question. You're missing the journey to get there. The shortcut is never valuable. There isn't just a simple, well, they did it like this, so we should do it like that. I really like that complexity. But the problem is, of course, you need 800 pages in which to describe that context.
Well, it's interesting. The book it's 800 pages. There are 8 books, and I would say to get the current contemporary value from it, you have to sift through a lot of discussion, a lot of language, a lot of concepts around the way that people fought in the Napoleonic era. And so there's a lot of tactical discussion around feeding horses, around moving, cavalry pieces around the battlefield, marching soldiers over long distances, which clearly has less relevance today than it did back then. And it goes back to, Clausewitz's own words about, taking the general, not the specific lesson from history. So you do have to read 800 pages, or you can listen to this podcast. There's an interesting point there where you talk about the interpretation and the fact that these are not rules, these are concepts. And I'm going to go back to this and put this central gravity point to bed, because at about 42 points throughout the book, there are discussions Clausewitz has that could be interpreted as talking about the center of gravity. But he doesn't use the term center of gravity. And to be honest, my German, I don't speak German, so I am effectively going off what other people's translations are.
Yeah.
Michael Howard that used the term center of gravity. Your German's better than mine, so you can pull me up on this. But he talks about Schwerpunkt, and we've talked about Schwerpunkt before, which means main focus.
Yep.
And he talks about ein Zentrum der Kraft und Bewegung, which means the center of power and movement.
Yep.
My German pronunciation there is utterly
no, that was very good. And by the way, Schwerpunkt, as a more literal translation, is a heavy point.
Yes.
Punkt is a point, and so Schwerpunkt is the point of focus, the point which people talk about sort of punching through in the Schwerpunkt.
The Schwerpunkt. So we've got ein Zentrum der Kraft und Bewegung and Schwerpunkt. And he talks about these two things, and these have been interpreted as he was talking about the same thing, the center of gravity, the point at which there is critical failure. But actually, he doesn't at any point say an entire military strategy will have a center of gravity that when you focus your capabilities against their critical vulnerability, the whole thing will collapse like a house of cards. He talks about applying capability against the center of power and movement, but he talks about that in the context of the combat. And the combat for Clausewitz is effectively what we would call, an engagement or a battle. It's this idea of many combats. The result of many combats will make up the strategic outcomes. The tactics is the use of capability in the combat. So he literally says tactics is the means within which one conducts actions in the combat. Strategy is the use of multiple combats to succeed in achieving the peace or victory. And we've interpreted this and then made our own conclusions about how centers of gravity are used in what we call campaign planning. Now, a campaign to Clausewitz was based around seasons and transport. So in the Napoleonic era, the winter fighting season was very limiting in how you could deploy forces. So if you're on mainland continental Europe, you would be able to fight over far smaller distances than you would in the summer months. And therefore, the campaign was effectively a year of operations. Whereas for us, a campaign is just the beginning to the end of the war itself. But we've interpreted this center of gravity thing, and we've created our own axiomatic process, which is, follow these steps and you will find the enemy center of gravity. As a result, there is a huge amount of discussion in military academic circles about what that actually means, how it should be done. Can you have a person as a center of gravity? Was Churchill the center of gravity for, British fighting power in the Second World War? And there's all sorts of discussions and essays and stuff. This, to me, is where we've taken the idea of Clausewitz and run with it to create this mythological sort of caricature, taking the point which is, I think, no more complicated than recognizing the asymmetry of applying lots of capability that you have to the weak points of the adversaries. As I say, up until this point, there is a sense in military fighting that you apply your army against their army and the bigger army will win, and then that's the combat complete. What Clausewitz talked about is the use of maneuver, and of course Clausewitz isn't the inventor of maneuver. He's not we can't, it'd be too much to say he was the inventor of the maneuverist approach, but he just talks about the fact that there is this interplay between the combat, the tactics, the fighting, and the process before that, the planning to make sure the right combats happen. And therefore, you need to be applying your capability against the weak points of the adversary, their center of power and movement. And that should be where your spare point is. That's where your main focus should be. So it's no more complicated, I think, and this is my interpretation of it, than he is reinforcing the need for the maneuverist approach, asymmetry in combat. You shouldn't put your infantry against their infantry. You shouldn't fight your war by going head on against their army. You should try, and this is where the Sun Tzu idea of the acme of strategy is avoiding the fight by removing the adversary's capability to fight. I think that's that. And I think that is a really good example of where we've taken the concepts on war and we've run with them and created this sort of legend and mythology, and we've overcomplicated it. We've then added our own interpretations, our own lessons, our own experience to it, and yet we call this Clausewitzian. Well,
I was going to say the what's the difference between useful expansion and extrapolation versus analyzing to a degree that was never intended. I remember when I was at school doing, studying, I can't remember what it was. I think it was Shakespeare probably. And we literally pulled apart every word, every meaning. And there was a point at which I think my teacher was, now you truly understand Shakespeare. And I actually felt really bad and thought, I don't think I do, I think Shakespeare was a bloke who wanted to tell a good story. And I think it'd be quite grumpy if we spent 8 weeks pulling apart everyone and be like, just sit down and watch the bloody play. And turning that back to where we are, and maybe it's interesting. We've been doing this podcast for now over a year, and I'm still realizing the reasons we're doing it. This is yet another thing which says, don't read a rule and apply a rule. It's the thinking that really matters. And so I think your argument is they took someone who said it's really important to think, and I've written down my thinking, and you should think like me. And people went, yeah, totally, Clausewitz. Anyway, what did you say? Look, those were the 3 rules. Hey, everyone, we've got the 3 rules for victory in battle. And that's the failure in this activity.
Yeah, I think, absolutely. And having sat through similar English classes and, being bored to tears, trying to analyze bits of Shakespeare, I absolutely empathize with that view. I think what's important is the conversation. What's important is the discussion. The problem we have is that we are now discussing not on war, because as I said, I've had a military career and I've only just got round to reading this book. But yet I've had many discussions. I've written essays on this, and yet I've not read the book. And this is a fairly typical thing. It is a difficult book. It's 800 pages, but it's difficult. It's hard going. But you can't talk about Clausewitz if you haven't read the first-hand text. And so a lot of what we talk about is, we're not talking about Clausewitz. We're talking about Michael Howard's interpretation of Clausewitz, or we're talking about one of the other historians' interpretation. And then you end up with kind of compounding, they're not even errors, they're just compounding impressions.
Well, perhaps we get further and further away from the original meaning. We see this, there are religious texts, and everyone who has a religious text is going to be angry at me now, which is like, the further you get away from the person who authored those texts, you have to say, is that really what they meant? And for those of you who are not necessarily religious, the US Constitution seems to be a perfect example.
Yeah,
I am a constitutionalist, and the words that were written we must take literally. Really? So this is a challenge. All right. Well, look, let's take a break, because I want you to be able to come back. I'm fascinated to learn about the books. So we'll take a quick break and we will see you back in just a second.
Wonderful.
Welcome back. We have talked about center of gravity. We used words like Schwerpunkt, which I always like as a half German. But we promised we'd come back and you'd talk more about the book. So Gareth, let's talk a bit about the books and maybe some of the key points from some of those books.
Yeah, cool. So like I said, there are 8 books and they are, I mean, it's broken down in quite a logical manner. And as I said, the first books are clearly books that he spent a lot of time researching, reflecting, writing, editing. You know, they're quite comprehensive. And then as you go further through, they become less, I would argue, less reflective, and the sense that these are notes that have been pulled together by an external editor starts to come through. But book 1 is on the nature of war. And effectively, it explores the definitions of the nature of war, and it discusses the inherent complexities and uncertainties. And one of the things Clausewitz talks about is the fact that war is absolutely a mix of planned, thought about, organized, controlled, rehearsed process and absolute chaotic chance. And the initiative and behavior of irrational people can undermine really process-driven, planned out processes. And we'll come on to some of the key things that come out later on, but this sense that war is, the nature of war is human, is something that endures to this day, and we talk about quite a lot, which is war is about achieving your will over somebody else. And by somebody else, that could be, you know, a nation state, a group of people, a culture. And it is inherently complex because it is a human endeavor. So you can't solve war like a puzzle. And there is always this needing to, and it comes back to what we were talking about a few episodes ago, where we talked about, you know, the Heisenberg principle and the fact that you can't observe a particle and know where it is at the same time as knowing where it's going, you know, how fast it's going, its velocity. In war, you can't identify the solution and then go and apply it, because by applying it, you're changing that operating context, you're increasing the complexity, and therefore there is this need for adaptive approach. And that's something that endures to this day and absolutely comes through in our thinking about resilience, adaptability, agile approaches. Book 2, on the theory of war, examines the sort of theoretical aspects of war, including sort of principles of strategy and tactics. And as I said, tactics is this kind of idea of winning a combat. Strategy is the idea of multiple combats achieving those political strategic goals. And I think for me, this is really important, because this links to what we've talked about before. Now, where Clausewitz is very, very clear that he's talking about strategy as a way of winning wars, a way of winning conflicts that involve extreme violence. And he explicitly says, I'm not talking about things outside of the human condition of inflicting violence upon one another. And I think that's really interesting, because a lot of what we've done with the word strategy and our thinking about strategy is to take it out of that military context and try and apply it into the business world or into the science world. Or that's a really useful conversation, but that's not what Clausewitz was all about.
Was it more Clausewitz saying, you may choose to apply it elsewhere, but I am confidently talking about this definition? This is what I'm sure of. In other words, is he trying to say you should not apply this to anything else because this is unique to war? Or is he just saying, I'm talking about war, this is what it's about, I'm not trying to make claims about anything outside that?
I think it's that latter one. And I think it's not because he's limiting himself and saying, well, I'm a soldier, so I'm only going to talk about war. I think back then, the term strategy was only ever used in the context of conflict. And so this idea of strategy being something you could apply to the commercial world or other aspects of human existence just hadn't occurred to people. And I don't think strategy really sort of broke out into the commercial world until probably after the Second World War. It was a kind of 50s, 60s thing. Now, of course, people have taken lessons from conflict and applied them to other bits of life for centuries. But the term strategy itself was very much focused on
military.
The military world. Although he absolutely talks about the link between the politics and the military.
Well, it's funny, at the risk of doing ourselves out of a podcast, I wonder whether it's worth us exploring another time what are the limits to comparing military and business. Yeah. Because I think our premise has been there is a lot more than you might imagine, but actually we've implied there's more, but we haven't said, is there a limit? And maybe that's an interesting conversation. It's almost, Clausewitz was saying, I'm not going to imply anything. Good luck. You should go talk about that.
Yeah, I don't think he's even saying that. I don't think he's even acknowledging that this could be taken out of other contexts. Book 3 is of the strategy in general. And this focuses on, as you'd expect, strategic aspects of warfare, discussing the importance of clear objectives and the balance between politics and military strategy. And so this is where he introduces these ideas of that paradoxical trilogy and how the tension between people's will, the art and capability of military force, and the end results, the strategic objectives, being driven by the political situation and the political powers that be imposing external pressures on military decision making. Really interesting. I think for us, the key point is it talks about having very, very clear visions about what the end objective is, because otherwise you end up marauding across Europe, fighting wars for the sake of fighting wars.
Luckily, we haven't had any of that in the last few years where people weren't clear on the final outcomes. Every war that I can think of in the last 30 years has been very clear and simple. People say, we're job done, we should go now. So we can move on from that.
Yeah, absolutely. And so there's a lot we can take from book 3 in terms of, and I think you can apply this more generally, these ideas of having clear objectives, articulating visions, and how those ends, those clear objectives, should be the start point for identifying the ways and means in which you're going to achieve those ends. And we're going to do a whole session on approaches to strategy, both military and commercial, fairly shortly, I think. Book 4 is the combat. It addresses the sort of technical aspects of warfare, including sort of the dynamics of battle and the role of leadership. And there's a lot of discussion in book 4 around the interplay between rehearsed drills or sort of choreography of the process of war, taking the doctrine, and the human nature aspects of the will to fight, fear, leadership, leading by example. And the lesson that comes out of book 4 for me is the fact that you can have the best doctrine, you can have the best drilled processes, but if you don't lead your military force, your army, in a way that gives them the sense of confidence and the purpose and the will to fight, then it will all collapse. And I think taking that, abstracting it away from the military, it's effectively that balance between the science of management and the art of leadership. Book 5 is the combat in general. So it talks more about the general conditions that create operations. So there's lots of discussion about the effect of weather and terrain. And again, this is perhaps where there is less to be taken away here, because he talks very particularly about the effect of weather on the maneuvering of cavalry, horse-drawn artillery, and soldiers marching about in columns.
Is there anything to be learnt, though, in terms of saying the impact of external forces on a particular capability? Is there anything that can be generalized? Because in this case, obviously, it was like, if you want to drag a gun around, you need a set of horses. And if it's raining and muddy, that's harder. Not as interesting anymore. But the statement saying, if you have capability A and this thing happens, I don't know, the electromagnetic frequencies are impacted. Is there anything that can be drawn from that?
Yeah, and in a podcast that's going to be just over an hour, it's very difficult to actually go into it detail. I'm gonna, once we've gone through all the books, I'm gonna go through the key things that come out.
Sorry.
A lot of
Next
these
book.
they're golden threads and strands that come through each of the books, and they build and compound as they go through. So book 6 is defense. And again, that's discussing the strategies and tactics of defensive war, the advantages of being in a defensive position, and linking this strategically to when you might want to cede space for time, where you might want to take a pause, reconstitute, use your sacrifice of tactical capability, i.e. putting forces in the defense in order to save other capability to apply in a different combat. So this is, I suppose, when you start thinking about strategy in that very simplistic kind of game of chess, a sort of analogy, this is kind of that idea of sacrificing pawns in order to gain advantage in a wider situation. Lots to be learned, lots of discussion around the balancing of sacrifice and, you know, where to cede ground, where not to. Lots of, I thought, echoes here with some of the reading I've done around Sun Tzu, and probably the book that most simply reflects kind of the broad understanding of strategy from the idea of balancing tactical capability for the long term. Book 7 is the attack, so what we would call offensive operations. And again, it's exactly the same, but now talking about where you can gain advantage and from going on the offensive. And there's lots of stuff in here about risk and risk calculus and initiative. And there's a theme that comes through in all these books and throughout On War, which is this idea of there is uncertainty, and uncertainty is something that cannot be managed through doctrine. Uncertainty is managed through initiative and creativity. And that's something that we have absolutely talked about lots in the past. And that book 7, for me, the key message there is you've got to delegate authority downward, clear visions, but allow people the opportunity to seize the initiative when they are presented with the right information. And there's an awful lot of discussion about how you do that and the risk calculus. But effectively, the overriding lesson from book 7 is if people understand what their part of the plan is, if they understand what they're trying to achieve, then when the situation around them presents an opportunity, they will take it. And it's this balance of empowerment, clear vision, clear articulation of where the limits of their decision-making are, but allowing trust in junior commanders to seize initiative, which absolutely emulates a lot of the conversations we've had when it comes to mission command. Book 8, the final book then, is War Plans, and the idea of planning both in the execution of combat, so tactical planning, and the execution of military campaigns, so strategic planning. And there's a lot in here about the balance of logistics and the operational aspects of sustaining the force, the use of intelligence, so information gathered by going out and conducting surveillance and reconnaissance in order to allow your decision-making to factor in the current conditions, the enemy, what they're trying to achieve, and then linking it all together with that underpinning operational. He doesn't use the term operational, that's a contemporary one. He talks about the link between the combat and strategy, but the combat is effectively that operational level. So this idea of logistical sustainment of multiple combats across a theatre of war, that's what we've talked about before in terms of that operational level of decision-making and command. And for me, there's a whole load in here about the balance of planning and being able to empower people to take initiative, balance risk, make decisions during the execution of combat without being prescriptive. So how do you plan enough that people have the right information, they know what they need to achieve, without being overly prescriptive about what they have to do? And this, for me, is the culminating book. And although it's not necessarily the tightest in terms of how it's edited, it brings together this golden thread throughout the whole of On War, which is this idea of empowerment, mutual trust, the balance of the science of management and the art of leadership allows for an adaptive force that has resilience against the random chance, what Clausewitz describes as the fog of war. And that resilience provides the opportunity to seize initiative. And throughout all of this, I think there are some really key themes.
A couple of observations. Von Clausewitz is a very modern thinker. Now,
Yes.
to be fair, there's an element of bias that we're going, oh, look, we've talked about that. But I do get the sense that the concepts that we understand and know were very familiar to him. And perhaps it would be a different language, but very quickly over a stein of beer or a schnapps or whatever you drink, we'd get very close. The second thing that it's so easy to forget that these 8 books and every topic we've ever talked about is not an academic activity. And what I mean by that is the sole purpose of every single one of these conversations is for a military force or a business organization to be successful. And therefore, this is only useful if enough people in your organization understand, embrace, and use these things. Now, I'm imagining with Clausewitz, and it feels very much like it's like, if you're a general, you need to read Clausewitz. The people at the top understand. But by definition, if it's just the people at the top understand, this can all fall to bits very quickly. It has to be throughout the organization. Everyone has to understand this. You know, you talked about sort of empowerment and initiative taking. The general has to say to his next in command, you need to take the initiative. The next in command is, that seems to me to be a different kind of problem, which is we've worked out some of these guiding principles and ideas. How do I now make sure that it's not just the people who can get through 800 pages that live it and breathe it? And obviously in the British Army, Staff College or, you know, Junior War College, as people go through. But that to me is just one person going, I know how to do this, or 3 people saying, I know how to do this, ain't going to win the war for you necessarily.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think I'd like to sort of round this off with for me, the 9 sort of guiding principles. And I use that term with caution because, as I said, Clausewitz would roll in his grave and probably commit a cavalry charge against me if he thought that I was trying to somehow codify 800 pages of insight, experience, knowledge and thinking about war into 9 axiomatic rules to take away. But
stop the boats, half inflation, that kind of thing.
Exactly, which in itself is not strategy. So let's be very clear, setting out lists of things is simply the signposts for much deeper conversations. But the first one is, war is an act of force to compel an enemy to do our will. And so this is not about stealing stuff from the enemy by taking bits of land. This is not about rescuing fair maidens in castles. This is literally about compelling other people by an act of force to do our will. And this comes back to this idea of it's politics. It's an extension of politics by other means. When politics fails, When you cannot achieve your strategic objectives through peaceful means, war is the result. And it is by its nature a human endeavor that includes the use of extreme acts of violence between humans on each other, and is a ghastly and horrible thing. However, it is a human nature thing, and therefore it is absolutely something that we need to think about, study, and be good at. And he talks a lot about the moral hazard and the moral conditions, but also recognizes that you can't impose rules that limit what you're going to do, that allows an adversary to gain advantage. And we'll talk about the kind of idea of that.
Well, can I give you a phrase? Total war.
Total war is something that, yeah, comes from Clausewitz, and the question comes up about when you start to cede advantage because of moral concern, what you effectively do is give advantage to the enemy. And he talks about compassion in war being absurd. We're going to come back to that in a moment. What he doesn't say is you will, need to throw all the rules out the window and become savage. It's absolutely just a recognition that we are talking about something that is as serious as compelling one person to go and take the life of another, or multiple people, with extreme violence. And so the seriousness of the context of what we're talking about comes through. Secondly, war is like a game of cards, and there is always a factor of luck and chance. And he talks about this idea of the fog of war, which is the fact that the weather on any given day can surprise you. There will be stuff that you don't know. There will be stuff that you're basing on assumption. There will be the individual acts and behaviors of irrational people that give you huge compounding advantages, or give the adversary huge compounding advantages. And therefore, in the planning and execution of combat, you must take into account the fact that this is not a controllable thing. It is not a complicated problem like a puzzle that can be solved. It's like playing poker. There is a chance element, there is a psychological element, and there is a physical element. War is a continuation of policy by other means. We've discussed this already, but you must recognize that, given what we said in the first of these sort of principles, that war is an act of force to compel our enemy to do our will. Our will is the result of political machinations, and therefore the military commander is restrained by an external force. And that's why there's this paradoxical trilogy, this idea that you could win a fight if there weren't rules, but there are rules, because to achieve your strategic goals, the rules are created above the military system. And that brings us on to this sort of paradoxical trilogy that we've kind of already talked about, which is the primordial violence, or the individual, so the human nature, the emotions, the passions, the inherent irrationality of human behavior. And then you've got the government, or the instrument of policy, and the decision apparatus that directs and manages the constraints that are put upon the general. And then the professional army, or the profession of arms, the military. And I've already kind of talked about how I think that links to potentially ideas like Adair's balls of team, task, and individual being in harmony. And he talked a lot about harmony of this paradoxical trilogy, and the fact that the skill, or the acme of a general, is not the balancing of people, the army, with the mission, but it is this constant tension and keeping in balance the emotional behaviors and irrationality of people, the governance that creates these external pressures on achieving that strategic objective, and then the balance of professional arms in terms of capability, doctrine, practice, experience, all of which is in competition with this fog of war, this chant.
It's interesting. I know we've done an episode where we talk about VUCA, but one of the things I'm really taking away from this is the most successful military commanders, I'm using that as a proxy for all these different parties, are the ones that can best manage and deal with this complexity.
Yes.
It's not just like, do you get the rules? I get the rules. It's okay, now how do you manage when these different factors change, and how do you react to those? And that's a different, actually, as I think back on my sort of leadership time, nobody's really talked about that. They've talked in terms of, if you know the rules, you will be successful. No one's actually said, yeah, great, the rules are the beginning, but now I want to throw in these 18 factors. How are you going to resolve these factors and apply these rules and adjust them to get there? That's a very different definition of a skill of a leader, when the assumption is it's the core knowledge and skills that make the difference, when actually there's a bigger, almost overarching and more important factor, which is, yeah, but how do you deal with 8 different things? We talked about the fact that I was politely booted out of the Royal Navy because I couldn't navigate an aircraft. Actually, what I was specifically asked to politely leave the Navy for was, I could understand the individual principles, but when you shoved all of them together and you sent me at 300 knots in the air and I had to do 8 different things, I was not able to deliver the outcome. Maybe there's an analogy there. We should talk more about that practicality.
Yes, and that brings me on to principle 5, the emphasis on military genius. Now, you've got to remember, this is 1831 is when he died, so he's been writing this since about 1800. This is the age of romanticism. This is the age of sort of, the romantics.
Do you mean dueling scars and funny moustaches and
funny moustaches and Byron and Keats and absolutely. So the Industrial Revolution hasn't happened yet, but this is probably the age at which we are starting to see the role of empirical science and the interplay between empirical science and the romantic view of the age of humanity. And I think for Prussia, at the center of Europe, Clausewitz is at the heart of what they see as leading the world forward. So there's an element of that comes through, but effectively what he's talking about in the emphasis on military genius is kind of what you've just described. It's having people that not only know all the doctrine, they've practiced, they've done the things, but when under pressure, when confronted by the fog of war, when confronted by the novelty, those intrinsic rolls of luck, the rolls of the dice that go in your favor, the rolls of dice that go against you, the imposed restraints that are put upon you because this is an extension of politics, can rise above and show a clear advantage over those that can't. And he talks about people that are effectively sort of constrained by their own dogmatic approach to following the rules versus those that can see an opportunity and seize initiative. And I think this is very similar to what in the British military and I've mentioned this before, we talk about the flash of the kingfisher, which is a single line from 7 Pillars of Wisdom, Lawrence of Arabia. He talks about the flash of the kingfisher as an analogy for the insight that a great leader has at the moment where all the things come together in a crescendo and you see the way out. And you don't see that way out because you studied it at War College. You don't see that way out because you're a reckless gambler. It's the combination of knowledge, skill, experience, and then that what Clausewitz talks about as military genius, but I would argue
creativity.
It's creativity and it's intuition. And it's what I would argue Daniel Kahneman talks about as system 1 thinking. And we've moved really far forward over the last 30 years when we look at behavioral economics to recognize the power of our subconscious mind in taking system 2 thinking, conscious thought and turning that into intuition. And so there's a tendency to read in Clausewitz if you wanted to, a sense that there is this great man theory, that there are people who are born natural military geniuses. I don't think that is the lesson. I think what he's talking about is people that have the ability to combine their intuition, that is a muscle that has been exercised and practiced, with their current conscious knowledge to make choices that exploit opportunities. Lots more to be said on that, but I think this idea of military genius is not there are people who are just born genetically better than others.
This whole series of talks where we talk about influencers is exactly that. I don't think at any point we've said, you know, person X, Dolly Parton, Steve Jobs, they're just brilliant. We can't replicate it. Actually, as you talk about it, we can't capture the 100% of it, but you can say, look, they're doing this thing and they're doing this thing and it's different and this is a good thing and a bad thing. So I like the refutation of the great man theory. I like that. I don't want to believe you can only be one of the blessed people who is a blessed great person. I believe in the fact that all the things you've talked about you know, understanding the doctrine, learning the lessons, but experience, intuition, creativity, these are the things that come together. And what we do is we describe them as great people, as opposed to that was the destination they got to, rather than they started as a great person and everything else kind of fell in front of them.
This is perhaps the one point where I think I am possibly retrospectively applying contemporary knowledge to Clausewitz writing. I'm not convinced Clausewitz wasn't a believer in the great man theory. As I said, it's the age of romanticism, and there are lots of things that point to this idea that you have intuition because of previous experience and knowledge. And
but let me ask you a question then. Is there anywhere on war where Clausewitz says these are all things that great people understand? Because what it sounds to me like is he is constructing in his own mind, let's take this to pieces. What is it that gives you success, in a way of saying, I'm showing you the building blocks. It implies he doesn't think there is a great man theory, unless it actually says, by the way, great people, they just are born knowing this stuff, and we just watch it.
He absolutely doesn't. And, you know, he's not laying out, you know, these are great people and, you know, they're born like that. But I also think I am probably retrospectively applying what I know about behavioral economics, what I know about psychology, to an age where none of that was really understood. And let's be honest, Clausewitz comes from an imperial class of Prussian officers. Class was still a large part of the system. And I think it is probably very probable that there would have been a little bit of classism in his view of who has military genius. Nothing is actually explicit in the book. Principle 6, friction. I've talked about the idea of the fog of war, but he explicitly says something that we have said in a different way, which is, he says, in war, everything is simple, but the simplest things are difficult. We've talked about being brilliant at the basics. And I think those two things are analogous. And it's this idea that you must anticipate the things that you think are just going to happen naturally. You think they're simple, I'm just going to tell people to do it. They're the things that you need to follow up on. They're the things that you need to reinforce. They're the things that you need to plan for going wrong, rather than coming up with, you know, grand tactics that are going to outwit the enemy through force of genius. Actually, what he talks about is, you know, the friction of war, the fog of war will do that job for you. What you need to do is you need to make sure it doesn't undermine what you're doing. So war is simple. The simplest things are difficult.
I think this is, I mean, we haven't talked a lot about business today, but I would say I'm going to go steal that. Business is simple, but the simple things are hard. I cannot tell you the amount of times in every business I've worked in, people have rolled their eyes and say, that should be quicker, that should be easier.
Yeah.
And that's a fair statement, but it implies there is somehow some malevolent force or stupidity, as opposed to von Clausewitz, who's saying, no, that is the way things are. And so rather than bemoan that fact, you should spend every moment of your day saying, how do I reduce that friction?
Yeah.
It's not stupid people making friction. It is the nature of business and the nature of war that makes simple things hard to do.
Yes, and he explicitly talks about commanders appreciating that things are difficult for their subordinates as well, which for me is a really, really important point, which often gets missed or underappreciated, which is, yes, the simple things that you're trying to do are difficult, but the simple things for people beneath you or in your system that you're relying on are also finding things difficult. So you must anticipate that they're going to take longer to do things. They're going to use more resources to do things. And that is the first sort of discussion around that mutual trust and that empowerment and that mission command, which I think we quite often miss. We talk about a lot the idea of telling people not what to do, but what to achieve. We talk about empowerment of decision making, but part of that is also that retrospective assumption that they're not going to be as quick as you think they are, because at their level, they understand the complexity of their situation better than you do. So you must naturally assume that if you think it's going to take, 2 days to do a job, then when it takes 2.5 days, you shouldn't be disappointed. And he talks about.
You told me a fantastic, I was going to say story, but you told me how the military does it, which is how you need to think about delivering orders. And you would assume that the first person giving the order gets the most of the time. And I think the way you explained it was, actually, that's a relatively small proportion of time, because they need more time to tell the people below, more time to tell. And so this feels like a really good example, which is, it's easy for me to think about how long it took me or it's going to take me, but you very rarely think about the next person or the next people down the chain.
Yeah, absolutely. We call it the 1/3, 2/3 rule. So absolutely at the highest levels of command, because you're planning, campaigns, you're planning across an entire theatre, things do take longer. You should have the most amount of time, but you've got to recognize how many layers there are below you and the fact that they need planning time for their complexity. So we have the 1/3, 2/3 rule, which is, if there is a predetermined amount of time between now and the time that you want the tactical application of capability, you want, in a military context, soldiers to go out the door. But we could use a commercial example and say, if you're the creative director of a marketing company and your client says, we need, the advert to go live or the campaign to go live on this date, what you do is you say, I have this amount of time between now and then. I will take 1/3 of it for me to come up with everything I need to come up with, to give all the direction I need to give, and I'll give 2/3 to everybody else. And then the next person at the next level of command says, how much time have I got left? Well, I've got this 2/3 block. I will divide that into 3, and I will take 1/3 of that. I'll give 2/3, and effectively that rolls all the way down until you've got the soldier in a fire trench who's given 15 minutes between now and having to go and assault the position, which is enough time to, check their weapon system, tighten all their straps, do their boots up, get ready, psychologically prepare, but they don't actually have to do a huge amount of complex planning, but you've given them time. And that rolls all the way through. I have, since leaving the military, seen loads of organizations, and I use that creative director kind of analogy because I see it worst in the marketing world, where the night before a pitch, and it's normally a sort of, they're given it on a 6 o'clock on a Friday evening, and they're told it needs to be ready for 9 o'clock on a Monday, and suddenly you've got creatives having to work really long hours over weekends when the strategy director has sat on that for 3 weeks, and it's just not fair. So yeah, absolutely. I think recognizing the complexity of the job of the people beneath you, rather than assuming that because your job is hard, theirs must be easier. The context is just different. The next one is war is a bad thing. So it comes back to this idea that war, like what I said with principle one, that war is an act of force to compel other people to do your will. Clausewitz absolutely recognizes that war is a terrible, terrible thing. And the fact that the human condition is blighted by this propensity to inflict violence on each other is a reality, and we shouldn't shy away from it. And he talks about the idea that kind of concepts around compassion in war is an absurdity. And at first glance, you read it and you think, well, that, in the modern age doesn't necessarily translate. But I think it does. And I think it's this idea that we conflate war and peace. And we conflate this idea of trying to solve the peace before we solve the war. And as I was coming up with my notes and reflecting on what I'd read in the book for this yesterday, it made me think about the Marshall Plan and the fact that during the Second World War, the Allies effectively continued the fight with the application of extreme violence right up until the surrender, right up until the end of the war. As soon as that happened, that was the time, and it's difficult to do, but that's the time where you need to switch to being compassionate and magnanimous. And that's the time for thinking about how you then rebuild. But you can't do that at the same time as trying to inflict your violence in order to compel others to do your will. This conflict of interests and this paradoxical situation where on one hand you are doing something to compel their will, and on the other hand you're effectively removing that edge and all you blunt your own tools. So
interesting. It's fight until you no longer need to fight, and then stop fighting and think about the peace.
Yeah, and he makes it very, very clear that fighting is not about vengeance, or shouldn't be. Fighting is not about inflicting violence upon people for fun, or because they did it to you, or because you can. It's about achieving goals. He also recognizes that because there is this trilogy, his paradoxical trilogy, and the people that he describes as the primordial violence will continue to have emotions after the peace. And so it is the military commander's job, it is a leadership job to rein in and stop vengeance, to enact benevolence, to enact magnanimity, to show compassion, but absolutely only at the point where the enemy surrenders. And I think there is a whole discussion to be had here about Western relationships between our physical hard power forces, our militaries, our government, the people in charge politically, and our society at large, understanding about what our force is for and when it is appropriate that it is used. And I think that's where Clausewitz, once again, is incredibly useful in the contemporary context. The final one is education is not for gaining experience, but for developing an independent judgment. Clausewitz reiterates time and time again the balance of knowing your stuff and being able to apply that to the context of the situation and applying judgment and initiative. And he talks about how good military commanders, yes, they absolutely need to study the mathematics of military, projectile trajectories. They need to understand the calculations involved in how much hay you need to feed your horses over so many days if they're marching so many miles, and all of that sort of objective military knowledge and professional knowledge in the force of arms. But actually, good commanders need to study history, they need to study philosophy, they need to study politics, and they need to study psychology. And he talked about how that is perhaps more important because a good commander can actually delegate the calculations about how much hay you need or how much water you're going to need to sustain your force or ammunition consumption rates. But being able to synthesize everything that's going on in terms of the current conditions, what you're anticipating the enemy are going to do next, the fog of war, the friction that will be created through chance, the balancing of people's irrational behavior and their emotional investment, and the empowerment of subordinates to take initiative requires far more than a study of doctrine. It requires far more than military professional knowledge. So education is not for gaining knowledge, it's for developing independent judgment. And this idea of critical thinking, I think we contemporary decision makers and contemporary managers will absolutely appreciate this, but this was revolutionary in 1830.
I hardly dare say it. I should go read this. I suspect I should go listen to an audio bit, but this is fascinating. I asked at the beginning, why has he stood the test of time? From what you have said, it sounds like because he had a remarkably prescient, thoughtful, and complete, in inverted commas, view about the prosecution of war and leadership and management. And it does surprise me, if you hadn't said this was Clausewitz and you'd have said it was someone else 10 years ago or 20 years ago or 50 years ago, I wouldn't have necessarily been surprised. And maybe that's a sign of how valuable and thoughtful his thinking is that as the context and the technology and the politics changes, these lessons still are true. So thank you for that. I also think it's very important for me to ruin all your good scholarly work and say the first mug we're going to get as merch is I prefer Clausewitz's balls, just because I think that takes us down a peg or two to where we really like. Now that was really, really interesting. Thank you very, very much for that, Gareth.
It's forced me to read a book that I've been saying I need to read for 2 decades.
Thank you. That was really, really good. Lots in there. Reminder to everyone, if you have enjoyed this, please go on to wherever you got the podcast and rate and do a review. We need other people to hear our ramblings, and we want more people to engage in the conversation. If you've liked what you've heard, or even better, if you haven't liked what you've heard, DM us on X, Battling with Biz, or email us, because you can then write a really comprehensive rebuttal of what we've said on battlingwithbusiness@gmail.com. Subscribe if you haven't subscribed, and perhaps most importantly, go tap a colleague on the shoulder and say, that conversation we had a couple of weeks ago, if you thought that was interesting, go listen to this podcast. We want to get more and more people. We want to build a much broader group of people who enter into these conversations. So if you share this with your friends, we would be very, very grateful. And on that note, I will leave us. Gareth, thank you very much. And thank you for another really, really interesting influencer.
Oh, you're more than welcome. Thanks very much.
Cheerio. See you next time.